Hello, everybody. Welcome to the midweek message from Messiah Lutheran Church in Mechanicsville, Virginia. My name is Pastor Ryan Radke. It is good to be with you all. Thanks for tuning in. I had a week off last week because, when you take a vacation, you need a vacation from the vacation. So just didn't make it to the midweek message last week, but we're back and we're starting something new. I'm calling this New Normals Are Messy, Conversations in Ezra and Nehemiah. This week, I'm going to just present an overview to you of these two books of the Bible and kind of an idea of what they're talking about in broad strokes and what we'll be talking about together. And then over the next few weeks, we'll divide these two books into chunks and we'll look them over together and see what they have to teach us. So there is a handout that goes with this. You can find that on our website, or if you're on our mailing list, you should have gotten a PDF of it. So I'm going to just kind of follow along with that with a little bonus content for you folks watching online and set the stage for the next few weeks. So first, why Ezra and Nehemiah? Why these books? Well, as we return to our sanctuaries and our church activities after such a long time being apart from one another, having our routines and our practices disrupted, we know that things won't just go back to normal overnight. So we were gone about a year and a half. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah tell the unique history of Israel's return to Jerusalem and the surrounding towns following around 70 years of exile in Babylon. The returning and rebuilding processes were messy, to say the least. We're going to spend the next several weeks looking at these two books together and seeing what this living word that is our scriptures has to teach us from their experiences for our situation today. But like I said, we're going to look at the overview first. In the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are usually included as one book, not two. It's only in, our English, more modern translations, Christian translations, that they get split. Um, some scholars speculate that they were written by the same author as First and Second Chronicles, which are kind of a slightly different version of Kings and Samuel, but not. Some folks think, well, First and Second Chronicles flows right into Ezra and Nehemiah, all the same person. Other scholars, not so sure. What we do know is that Ezra and Nehemiah tell the story of when the Persian Empire defeated Babylon, Babylon, who had taken Israel into exile. The Persians allowed the exiled Israelites to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and the city and start worshiping again in that way. Persian rulers who are mentioned in these books include Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes. And the events, and that you can tie these to actual historical stuff. Um, the events in Ezra and Nehemiah are centered in the late 6th century and early 5th century BC. Ezra means help in Hebrew. Ezra was a priest and a scribe or secretary, and he was appointed and or allowed by the Persians to reestablish the religious practices and laws of Israel um, with the returning people, get things back in order. Ezra is sometimes seen in some traditions as the restorer of the law of Moses, and you'll see some passages where he kind of hits the highlights of that law. Um, some say that Ezra's work through the Persian channels ended up helping to lead towards the first written versions of Hebrew scriptures that were completed. Ezra's story is also similarly told in a book called First Esdras, Esdras, A-S-A-S. If your Bible, a lot of Protestant Bibles, you can have the Apocrypha section. It has things like Tobit and Judith and Maccabees in it. You can find First Esdras in a lot of Protestant Apocrypha sections. Where I lost my spot. There we go. There's also a book called Second Esdras that's less canonical, less in the canon. It's a little bit funkier, let's say. It's much more of uh, kind of an apocalypse type of literature. Some Bibles you can find it, not all. It's still interesting, but it is not necessarily the story of Ezra uh, in the same way. There's that. Um, where was I? There we go. Nehemiah means Yahweh comforts in Hebrew, so you have help and comfort. Nehemiah had been a cupbearer to the king in Persia, but evidently had enough standing to request and be granted the ability to go to Jerusalem and oversee the rebuilding of the city and its walls. Nehemiah served two separate stints as a governor of Jerusalem. He went back to Persia in between, whereas Ezra was more of a priest uh, who was restoring the religious identity of the people. Nehemiah was more of a politician and a builder, restoring the security and the structures and the independence of Jerusalem. Although Ezra and Nehemiah are mentioned in some passages of Nehemiah as being in the city at the same time, many scholars believe that their times of service did not actually overlap. Does that matter? The grand scheme of things, probably not. It's just if you're a history buff or biblical interpret interpretation buff. Um, Either way, these two figures are seen in later records as heroes who helped reestablish Israel. Some other items of note. As you read through these two books, you will notice that the narrative sometimes switches between first person and third person. Other books of the Bible do this too. That really is just a way of telling you a heads up that can make things hard to follow sometimes. You might not notice, however, in the English translation, that some passages were originally written in Aramaic and some were written in Hebrew. Some slight but important differences in the two languages. There are also some passages that were Persian declarations being quoted directly. There's historical kind of confirmation of some of that. All this is to say, the translators had their hands full, and there are some passages that are easier to follow than others as you go through them. There's also, I don't think I had this in the written part, a number of sections where it's just long lists of names, like population counts and whose descendants were in the groups of returnees. I probably won't be reading those word for word. You can try if you want. Just know it gets a little bit wordy sometimes. Another piece is that these books were less concerned about being chronologically accurate. The historians play all sorts of acrobatics trying to match it up with when the different Persian kings served and who was where when. As you're reading, you might say, like, well, wait a minute, didn't this happen over there? Don't worry about it. That wasn't the main idea and focus of these writings. They were much more concerned with themes, restoration, and Israel as a holy remnant, reestablishing God's people in Jerusalem. Um, and you also might spot a couple of familiar names, at least, such as the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, each of whom has their own book in the Bible. So they were prophets active during this same period of history. And a general overview of the books, Ezra chapters 1 through 6 talk about the restoration of the Jewish community, including the temple after the exile. Chapters 7 through 10 talk about Ezra's mission, and that thread actually gets continued in Nehemiah 8 to 9. So you could read Ezra 1 through 10, jump to Nehemiah 8 and 9, and then come back for the rest. So Nehemiah 1 through 7 describes Nehemiah's commission and his first stint as governor. Chapter 10 tells the story of a new covenant being committed to by Israel. And then chapters 11 through 13 talk about the repopulation of Jerusalem, the dedication of the city walls, and Nehemiah's second term as governor. As the title for this Bible study mentions, new normals are messy. Ezra and Nehemiah face many challenges through the course of these two books. First, there's the conflict between the exiled Israelites returning to Jerusalem, many of whom were of the elite members of society and their descendants, and the people who had never left. Some were Israelites who were left behind, not the elite. Some were Samaritans who moved in from the north. Some were, as it says, local inhabitants, people of the land from the surrounding areas or from different ethnic or religious groups who'd married into Israel. Think your Ites, your Canaanites, your Hittites, your Jebusites, your Ammonites, all of those. But especially those that married into Israel, that becomes one of the main talking points in Ezra, especially. Samaria is especially hostile to Ezra, as they felt they were worshiping the same God. Why shouldn't they be helped to rebuild and lead things? But Ezra was having none of it. The Samaritans didn't want the returning Israelites to take over after they'd been running things for more than 70 years or helping to run things. So there's many issues at play regarding the land and ownership and inheritance and things like that. There's also conflict when some of these other ites, the Canaanites, Ammonites, etc., offer to help in the rebuilding process itself. Um, their help is denied. Um, First, it's just general conflict, but then they specifically ask, can we help rebuild? Can we be a part of this? And no, they cannot. And then we get to the intermarriage issue between Israelites and other groups. And in this case, this gets harder to read. Ezra gets very focused on purity, and there are some tragically strict measures put into place to deal with the purity of the nation. And we'll get into that not next week, but probably the week after. Um, Ezra, in the process of that, interprets some laws from Deuteronomy, but he interprets them um, much more strictly than they had originally been understood in order to enforce his policies. Nehemiah also confronts some adversaries. Specifically, three are mentioned from Ammon, Arabia, and Samaria. First, these rivals try to stall the rebuilding process by writing misleading letters to Persia. Israel's going to rebuild and take over. They're fierce. Don't trust them. And then later, they try to trick or threaten Nehemiah into stopping the building project of the city walls and the gates. Finally, one other conflict, Ezra and Nehemiah both have to walk this tightrope between keeping their new Persian overlords happy, it's better than Babylon, but also reestablishing Israel as independent and as a strong people once again. So, how do you do that without risking what Persia is doing for you? How do you keep Persia happy without alienating the people you're trying to build up? There's a tension there. So over the next few weeks, we'll dig into all of this, and we'll look at the parallels between our own return to worship after a year and a half of pandemic, because there are some. And we'll bring up the challenges that we face, not just in terms of COVID, but also in terms of what our identity as Christians is in a world and a society that have changed significantly over the last few decades. Maybe it's not just coming back from COVID that we're facing, but maybe it's coming back and really confronting head on how much has changed, let's say, in the last 50 years for us? And what does that mean for the church? Who are we now? What is our identity? Um, we'll talk about what it means to be a pure people of God and who gets to define that. And we'll talk about what brings us hope when it seems like our lives are in ruins and how God helps us to rebuild and restore. As one commentator summed up his thoughts on Ezra and Nehemiah, by the end of the story, the two emerge as cultural heroes who restore order and hope and give identity to a people in disarray. And before I finish, that's where the hard copy ends. I just want to read you something kind of cool. Picked this up a couple of years ago. It's called the Africana Bible. There you go. Reading Israel's scriptures from Africa and the African diaspora. It's a different perspective than maybe what we usually hear. So I was reading through this to see what it might have to offer, and I came across this section with the fun title of The Multivalent Rhetoric of Reform. So that's some $5 words there. Here's what it means. The reforms are presented as this is the reforms in Ezra 9 and 10 and in Nehemiah 10 and 13. So these reforms they put in place to, like I said, keep Israel strong and pure, but not upset Persia. That's why we're talking. The reforms are presented as a separatist rhetoric. Okay, we're going to be pure and separate from everybody else. The rhetoric's stark language is both poignant and provocative, and its content is morally disturbing, leaving the reader with unsettling questions. And we will get into that in a couple of weeks. But with this rhetoric, as it's coming across, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. He says it finds a parallel in the United States history in the antebellum period. African Americans held in chattel slavery understood the political value of a multivalent rhetoric. And here we'll explain that in a second. By the way, the author here of this section is named Herbert Marbury. African Americans held in chattel slavery understood the political value of multivalent rhetoric. Take, for example, the song Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, sung on antebellum plantations throughout the South. The lyrics read, Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home? A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. If you get there before I do, coming for to carry me home, tell all my friends I'm coming too, coming for to carry me home. Guessing maybe you've heard this song before. I know I have sung it before. It's famously featured in Spaceballs, but this is a lot more serious than how that was used. Yeah. This is something I kind of knew but didn't know. Clearly, such rhetoric accommodated the repression of slavery. It allowed the slaveholding class to participate in the myth of the slave's contentment with their social condition. The white slaveholding class heard African Americans singing this song on Sunday mornings in brush arbors and during the workday in the fields. For them, the song alluded to the story of the prophet Elijah in 2 Kings. It dramatized Elijah's reward for his faithfulness to Yahweh. The slaveholding class understood the elder prophet's ascension in Elisha's presence as a sign of God's satisfaction with his service. For them, the song articulated their slaves' future hope that after a lifelong tenure of acceptable service, God would allow them also to participate in Elijah's heavenly reward. The same rhetoric, this is the multivalent part, different levels, different meanings. The same rhetoric simultaneously facilitated resistance amid repression, however. African Americans held in chattel slavery constructed a far different meaning from that of their slaveholding counterparts. They heard the lyrics and knew that the sweet chariot was a metaphor for the Underground Railroad. Raising that song in church or in the field meant that the train was stopping in the vicinity that week or that evening. To swing low meant to stop by and pick up some new passengers. Home was not some spiritual afterlife, but rather life after slavery, that is, life anywhere north of the Mason Dixon line. The second stanza recalled the Jordan River. This is I looked over Jordan, what did I see? Band of angels coming after me. Second stanza recalled the Jordan River, the last natural boundary that the Israelites would encounter on their 40-year journey to freedom from Egyptian bondage. For African Americans, this marker was the Ohio River, the watery boundary that extended the Mason-Dixon line, separating slave and free states. To look over the Jordan was to envision all of those who had already escaped to freedom and beckon their sisters and brothers to join them. The third stanza is almost self-evident. It acknowledged the rigors and the risks of the route from slavery to freedom. It says, if you get there before I do, tell all my friends I'm coming too. Not all could join the band of escapees. Some were in no condition to make the long, hazardous journey. Some were afraid. Some stayed behind to facilitate the journey for others. The last line, however, articulated a universal hope that all would get there someday. Within a matrix of overwhelming repressive power, the rhetoric of the spiritual and its ability to play in and among the interpretive gaps and disjunctions between the social worlds of slave and slaveholder became a powerful subversive tool against repression. Such rhetoric is political. It takes sides. It simultaneously subverts and directs power. Black preachers and others who employed the song for political purposes carefully crafted a multivocal rhetoric in which both slave and slave master could participate, albeit with very different interests and understandings. Since the rhetoric was appropriately constructed to attend to each group's social and political interests, each group could participate in their own symbolic world of meaning. The slaveholder certainly would not have been aware that the rhetoric signaled the arrival of the Underground Railroad and the slave's intent for freedom here instead of in the hereafter. Those slaves who had not read 2 Kings or heard the story of Elijah preached might not have been aware that there was another signification for the rhetoric in the planter class's romanticized notions of slave piety. Only those individuals who traveled between both worlds, such as slave preachers, would have understood the rhetoric's double signification and why the song needed such a multivalent character to be effective. The separatist rhetoric of Ezra 9 and 10 and Nehemiah 10 to 13 is similarly multivalent. Like the spiritual swing low, sweet chariot, The rhetoric of Ezra and Nehemiah also emerges from a context of repression. Judah, that's the southern kingdom, suffered under Persian dominion that was no less brutal than that of the Assyrians and Babylonians before them, or that of the Greeks and Romans who succeeded them. And then it goes on to kind of unpack how it works in Ezra and Nehemiah. So I'll save that for our future conversations, but maybe that'll put you in the mindset of Ezra and Nehemiah and the kind of rock and a hard place they were caught between as they were trying to rebuild and restore. To think about those spirituals, those double meanings, and the line that folks had to walk. Because even though they were back in Jerusalem and out of exile, it doesn't mean that they were completely free. Um, so there you go. Lots of different strains we can lift up and bring up. I don't know that these are two books of the Bible that get talked about very often. It's kind of a stopping point on the way to other places, I think. So we'll take a couple of weeks and dig in and see what they have to say for us today. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned next week, and please, in preparation for next week, please read Ezra 1 through 6, chapters 1 through 6. If you want to see the sources where I got the information for this overview, please check the handout. They are all there. And we will see you next time. Take care.